Alright everybody, we are going to go ahead and get started today with our lesson. Take your books and turn to page number 426. Page number 426. Now, as you're turning there, I want to bring this chapter into focus, because there's a lot going on and there's a lot to keep up with. So we're just going to bring this into perspective here. So if you were to go to the beginning of the chapter, on page number 4, let me see here, on page number 416, you will see the graphic of the French flag, and you would see a quote, and the quote is from a historian, and this historian has said before, "When France sneezes, all Europe catches cold," meaning that France truly is the center of cultural Europe. And so what happens in France doesn't just affect France, it affects everybody. So what happens throughout the age of Napoleon creates his own form of Europe in his ideal mold. And what happens is Napoleon loses grasp on reality, and he eventually loses grasp on his empire along with it. In the wake of his first defeat, the Congress of Vienna meets. The Congress of Vienna, the whole idea is to create a form of stability that Europe can now rely on, because Napoleon has uprooted a lot of things that has taken place. And so what happens is they are at this Congress trying to set everything back to the way it was. There are a lot of people in Europe that hoped the Congress of Vienna would try to make the European nations look less like monarchies and make them look more like democracies. The problem was that the people that were delegates at the Vienna Conference were not interested in building new nations based on democratic ideals. Their goal was to set everything back to the quid pro quo, meaning they redraw borders, meaning they put old rulers that had been deposed by Napoleon, they try to put them back on the throne where possible. They try to set everything back. Then, as they're just about to complete everything that's going on in the Vienna Conference, they get word that Napoleon has escaped from exile, and he wants to try to stop them from creating this new Europe that looks strikingly like old Europe. And he wants to try to retain his empire. So after he loses at the Battle of Waterloo, the question then becomes, what is Europe going to look like? And that's what we're talking about. We talked about, in yesterday's lesson, we talked about the revolts, because again, the people inside these European nations were hoping for more democracies. We talked very briefly about the revolt of the 1830s in France. What happens is France sees the new government descend back into this old order of there being no democratic ideals. And so they pretty much just have these uprisings in an attempt to save France from this monarchy. If you read your lesson, you would know about the efforts that were taking place in Russia. Tsar Nicholas I was trying to combat these democratic ideals by pretty much just squashing any dissent within the nation. We call that Russification on page number 425. Then we're talking about the triumph of nationalism, and this is where we bring it today. So we talked about nationalism yesterday as being defined as a fervent love for one's nation or that nation's policies. So, in 1850, the spirit of conservatism and international cooperation established by the Congress of Vienna had waned. and the spirit of liberalism and nationalism had intensified. During the second half of the century, the mood of European politics gradually changed. The years of revolution had dispelled the zeal of romantic idealism. In its place, there arose a hardened realism. Like Machiavelli's Prince, European politicians and diplomats adopted a politics of necessity known as realpolitik, which is the politics of reality, in which they use whatever means necessary, including force, to advance their national goals. And this would become really important because this sets in, again, this is in the 1830s, but these type of the politics of reality, the politics of using whatever means necessary to advance their nationalistic goals, it will end up looking a whole lot like Adolf Hitler's takeover and Adolf Hitler's eventual capturing of basically the world's mind. And again, this is in the 1830s. Hitler isn't even on the page, but you're beginning to see the politics and the mind that the Europeans are falling into is actually beginning to set the table for Hitler years to come. So this policy of reality was their attempt to try to advance their national goals by whatever means necessary. The benefit of that country became the sole judge of right and wrong. Listen, we are Americans, and we want Americans to be treated correctly. We do want our American interests to be a part of our policy making. That's 100% true. The problem is, in Europe, it has come to the place where the reality is even morality is taking a back seat to the necessity and the desires of a nation, and that is very, very dangerous. So, with this mindset, several different conflicts began to take place. The first one was the Crimean War. Now, the Crimean War was the first major international conflict after the defeat of Napoleon. Now, Crimea is a very interesting place because it is still in America's collective mind now. You guys were not really paying attention, but in the early years of President Barack Obama's tenure in office, the Russian dictator, who is still in power, by the way, his name is Vladimir Putin, he annexes Crimea. Let me pull up here Google Earth, and I'm going to show you where Crimea is, because I don't believe it shows you. Oh, hold on, it's not on. It won't work with Safari. It'll have to work with Firefox. But anyway, this Crimean War, while I pulled this up, it was fought between Britain, France, and the Kingdom of Sardinia against Russia. So you have this alliance, and we've talked about alliances. Alliances are the combining of nations' armies in an attempt to keep the balance of power. The balance of power that's the alliances that take place between nations. And these nations have all come together in an alliance to try to fight against the Russians. So, what we have here's Crimea. It's an island in the, here it is. Alright, right here. It's a peninsula, rather. I said it was an island. It's a peninsula right here in the Black Sea. That is the Crimean Peninsula. Now, going back to what I was telling you about, in the early years of President Barack Obama, this peninsula was part of Ukraine. You see this borderline here. That borderline is new. That borderline is only been around since 2009, I believe. This used to be part of Ukraine, and the dictator of Russia, Vladimir Putin, he basically marched his men into Crimea. And, well, let me put it this way. He didn't take it over with an army. What he did was he sent in influencers, spies, you might say. And they got it to where the nation of Ukraine put a bill before their people, a national referendum. And if this national referendum was passed, then they would secede from Ukraine and join Russia, just become part of Russia. Well, Ukraine and Russia have been at war, shadow wars, really. They've been in shadow wars for decades. So they've always been fighting against each other. But this war was fought over that same peninsula. And by the way, they say all news is new news. Or all news is old news that's just happening to new people. What we have here is this Crimean War. It was the first international conflict after the defeat of Napoleon. And what happened was this. Russia wanted to gain more influence over their neighbors. And as Russia looked around, and they wanted to gain more control, the seemingly easiest nation to try to get land from was the Ottoman Empire. The Ottoman Empire is basically modern-day Turkey. Turkey had a lot of influence over the Crimean War, over the Crimean Peninsula. And so Russia wanted to take Crimea from the Ottoman Empire. But this alliance of Britain, France, and the Kingdom of Sardinia, they wanted to keep Crimea out of Russian control. They wanted it to remain part of the Ottoman Empire. Again, this balance of power they did not want to upset this. But the selfishness of nations around them to gain more land has resulted in this mutually agreed peace that took place at the Congress of Vienna, basically just flap away. Now, nationalism, and by the way, nationalism is a good thing, as long as your nationalism is rooted in a biblical, moral anchor. Nationalism is not bad. The love you feel for your country is a love that is well-based. There are going to be people out there that tell you that this idea of nationalism is a bad thing because it's always tied to Nazism. It's always tied to the Nazis because they were National Socialists. Don't let people tell you that. Nationalism, it can be used poorly. Hitler was a nationalist, but he was also an immoral man that didn't have a moral anchor to his body. And so his desires for his country trumped the God of the Bible. But nationalism, as long as you're fighting for God-given rights, is a good thing. Okay. Now, that's what nationalism looked like in Russia. Let's look at the nationalism that took place in Italy and Germany. One thing you notice right here. Italy at this time is a nation that really does not exist as one nation. It's more of a confederation. Look at this map. What you see is a bunch of smaller kingdoms that made up the Italian peninsula. You have the Kingdom of Sardinia. You have the Papal States. You have Tuscany. You have the Kingdom of the Two Sicilies down near the boot of Italy. These were all their own nations, Lombardy and then Venetia. These are all different, basically, kingdoms. But a guy by the name of Giuseppe Mazzini, he attempted to reunite all of Italy. And he was successful. In 1832, Giuseppe Mazzini started a patriotic society called Young Italy, determining to fight if necessary for Italian unification. But as late as 1851, an Italian historian wrote, the patriotism of the Italians is like that of the ancient Greeks, and is love of a single town and not of a country. It is the feeling of a tribe, not of a nation. Only by foreign conquest have they ever been united. Leave them to themselves, and they split into fragments. It's very interesting that Italy, which made up the Roman Empire, the greatest empire in the history of the world, and now in the 1830s and 50s, they have become so fragmented that they can't come together. They're not united. But Giuseppe Mazzini was the one that wanted to see Italy reunited. Now, this attempt to unify Italy is known as the Risorgimento, which is Italian for resurgence. This is that love for country, that idealism that is based on a love for country that is... This is good. I mean, as long as they're not resorting to violence. Reuniting is not a bad thing. Again, as long as they're not doing things completely antithetical to the Bible, as long as they're not murdering innocents, then this is the type of love for your country that you can you can hope for and desire. Again, all of this based on the assumption you're not doing harm to other people. That's the thing about independence. People ask about, well, what is freedom? Freedom is the opportunity. I get to swing my hands in whatever way I want until I hit somebody. Once I hit somebody, then that's when you're infringing on other people's rights. So, Giuseppe Mazzini wanted to reunite all of Italy. Now, Germany. Germany would be reunited by a guy by the name of Otto von Bismarck. Now, Germany was a lot like Italy in that it was made up of individual states. Look at your map on page number 431, and what you see here is what Germany used to look like. Now, in my book, I've got the teacher's book, and the teacher's book is all black and white, so I can't really discern what the colors are. But you can look at this, and you can see in the key here, there was Prussia before 1866. What was annexed to Prussia in 1866, what confederated with Prussia in 1867, and then states that were added to the German Empire in 1871, and then the boundary of the German Empire. So, Otto von Bismarck, he was the architect for the political reunification of Germany. So, one of the things about Germany has always been this. Up until this point in history, Germany has not existed as a single nation. They have existed as individual kingdoms that came together in times of war, but up till now, they really have not existed as one nation. And Bismarck can be given the credit for uniting Germany. Now, we're going to look now at some of the what's taking place now in Austria and Russia. So, the rulers of the Austrian throne, they were known as the Habsburgs, the Habsburg family. The Austrian Habsburg ruled over a varied and increasingly restless group of nationalities. Of these nationalities, the Hungarians created the most problems for the Austrian government. So, you look at the definition of nations, definitions of governments, for instance. The definition of an empire, several things, you have to have several things in order to have an empire. You have to have a decent amount of land, number one. Number two, you have to have a diverse set of population. And really, you look at the Austrian Habsburgs, they could say they ruled over a diverse amount of people. All of these different people groups and all these different ethnic backgrounds. The Habsburgs were able to say they had a lot of different people under their control. And the people group that provided the most problems for the Austrian government was the Hungarians. In 1848, under the leadership of Louis Kossuth, they had staged an unsuccessful revolt. So the Hungarians originally wanted their own state, and in 1848 they lost the attempt to become their own nation. But they didn't just go away. Later, after the Prussian victory over Austria, excuse me, in the Austro-Prussian War, the Hungarians again demanded self-government. But this time, the Austrians were in no position to reject their demands. The Austrians began to the Hungarians grew to the point where they could not be ignored. They would not be ignored by the Austrians. So the only way that the Austrians were able to keep their empire together was by giving the Hungarians equal partners. Now, the Hungarians caused so much problems for the Habsburg rulers of Austria that in order to prevent outright revolt, the Austrians made them equal partners with the empire, and this formed what has been known as the Austro-Hungarian Empire. And this is very important because it would remain the Austro-Hungarian Empire until the end of World War I. After World War I, one of the consequences is these nations would have to be broken up. But for now, they are now one nation. In Russia, Tsar Nicholas I has died, and it's in 1855. Who's going to come over and take the throne on his behalf? Well, it's going to be his son, Alexander II. He became the Russian Tsar in 1855, and he recognized that his father's policy of autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationalism had caused widespread discontent. Now, you should have read this in the section. Tsar Nicholas came up with a policy called Russification. So what happened was Tsar Alexander I. Tsar Alexander I tries to run the government on this plan of autocracy, orthodoxy, and nationalism. And this has caused a widespread discontent among the Russian people. But it also weakened Russia's position as a major European power, which resulted in Russia's defeat during the Crimean War. Consequently, Alexander implemented several social reforms. The most important came in 1861 when he abolished serfdom. When he abolished serfdom, he gave the serfs personal freedom and grants of land. Revolutionaries pressed him for further reforms, but he did not give in to all their demands. In 1881, he was assassinated. When his son Alexander III became Tsar, he returned to the harsh policies of Nicholas I. Okay, so that should be everything in the section. This is Friday's lecture. This coming week, you do not have school because of the spring break. We are still retaining spring break because we've not officially had any weeks off, because we've been working up until this point. So this coming week we'll still have spring break. The work will be due the Monday after spring break when you guys come in to get your assignments. Make sure you keep your eye on Google Classroom. I enjoy being able to communicate with you all that way. Make sure you keep your eyes on that. There might be something I need to post up there. Be sure to look at the daily questions. And I think that's it. I'm just going to go ahead and let you all know that I love you and I'm always praying for you. And I hope you have a great spring break.